So these are some of the things that we've been thinking about and talking about and hope to get to. This is one of our key partners. You'll find on Creatively United's website a great feast of ideas and solutions to all manner of issues. To be on the mailing list, just write to me, and I'm easy to find. And we're more than happy to have people with time and energy. We wouldn't say no to financial support, but we do run this thing pretty much on a shoestring. Most of our PowerPoints from past presentations going back 3 or 4 years now are on the Creatively United website, and the video recordings are on our own YouTube channel. So this year, our focus has been on the theme of a one planet region and what are some of the seeds of that. And so we've looked at, I'm just going to go back here for a minute. We've looked sort of basing it on Bioregional's 10 One Planet Living Principles. We've looked at One Planet Saanich in January and the Sauk Nation and Souk in Transition in February. We looked at economics in March, food in April, buildings now, and then in June, getting around. And then we'll take a break July and August, and we'll start again in September. And we'll go through the remaining principles of a one planet living in a one planet region. So things like waste and materials and energy and so on. These, in fact, are the other ones that we'll be going through. So these are the 10 principles that Bioregional developed that guide One Planet Saanich, but also in many ways guide us. And tonight we are going to be talking about building for a one planet region. How do we, and so the question when we get into small group discussions will be about how do we apply these ideas locally? How do we take these ideas forward to our own and other municipalities? And I'm delighted to say we've got 3 really interesting and good speakers. We've had fun putting this together. And Julian, who actually just made a presentation on this same issue at One Planet Saanich an hour or so ago. So he's had a dress rehearsal.
Trevor,
yeah.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you for a second? Just to ask the people mute their microphones if they're not speaking, and the other is to put their municipalities or neighborhoods into the chat box, please.
Yes, thank you. I forgot to make that point. So let me just finish introducing these 3, and then I'll just remind you again about that. So Julian is the founder of an organization called, or a business, a development called Urban Thrive. I'm not doing a fulsome long introduction because I want to give them time to speak. Christine is principal of her own architectural company, and Kaylee is the principal owner of Wiser Projects and is involved in planning and development. And they're going to be talking about this notion of building for a one planet region. Now, as Claire just reminded us, we're going to so our program is like this. We will have the speakers for till about 5:40, 5:45, the 3 of them, in that order that I just laid out. Then there'll be a bit of time for open discussion. And then we will take a short break, and Gertie and Claire, to whom I give thanks, will break us into small groups. We're going to break you into small groups based on your municipality, because so many of the issues here really come down to decisions by municipal governments about planning in their area. And then we'll break into small groups for about 35-40 minutes and reconvene around 6:40, 6:45 to get some feedback. And what we want you to think about in these sessions is how do we apply some of these ideas locally, and how do we take these ideas forward to our own and other municipalities? So how do we put into practice some of the ideas that Julian and Christine and Kaylee are going to be sharing with us, and they will have some thoughts too about how to do that. So my thanks to Gertie and to Claire for managing the breakout room assignments, and obviously my thanks to the 3 speakers. And just a quick reminder, we show it every month, some small group discussion guidelines courtesy of Jan Ingalls, who reminds us about being mindful of the time we have, no side conversations, speaking from your personal experience. We don't want abstract debates or blaming rants. We really want to talk about, okay, what can we do here? How can we make this happen? Listening with curiosity and open-mindedness, and so on. So with all of that, I will stop the slideshow, and just to remind you, as Claire did, that we would like you to in the chat box, if we don't already know, if you haven't been part of this before, let us know which municipality you're in so that we can assign you to the right municipality for the breakout groups. Claire and Gertie, anything I need to add?
No, I can't think of anything. It looks good.
Okay, well, in that case, I will turn this over to Julian West.
Trevor, thanks so much. I want to share my screen here. And for those of you who were in the One Planet Saanich group, I'm happy to say that I'm doing a different emphasis here, just to kind of match the scope and topic of what Trevor has outlined for a conversation tonight. So shouldn't be a repeat of the last one if you're joined with the Saanich group. Can everyone see my screen okay? Is that coming through okay?
Yes, it is.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, Trevor, thank you. Really happy to be here. I think this is just a massively important topic, and I love the grassroots format of this. I think that's how change always starts, and we certainly need a lot of change. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I'm about and what I'm trying to do, and kind of how that fits into the bigger picture of housing, and then how that even relates to our natural ecosystem and sustainability more generally. In the interest of time, I'm going to start with the assumption that people in this group already understand that urban sprawl and our dependency on cars is unsustainable, that you have at least a general background on that. And the fact that we have to make better use of the land we have instead of cutting down our natural ecosystems to expand continually outwards as we do today. So using that as a given, I'd like to tell you about how difficult it is to build good density, the kind of housing that we need to create, I think, healthy and sustainable communities. So quickly, a little background first. I am a social enterprise real estate developer. I build car-free, gentle density housing. What that means is we directly tackle private car ownership by building and designing our projects from the ground up on sustainable mobility, walking, cycling, transit, and car share. Gentle density means that we aim to fit into the scale and character of existing neighborhoods. So we're talking about townhouses, houseplexes, and so forth. Things that are sort of the next increment of scale and density to what's already existing there to move us forward, but still sort of respect and honor what already exists in those neighborhoods. We have 2 projects on the go right now. We've got one at 2859 Richmond Road in Saanich. This image in the background is from that project. And then we've got another one in Vic West, which we'll be announcing in the near future. This is my overly long mission statement, but in a nutshell, we're trying to stop urban sprawl by creating a compelling alternative to urban sprawl, which in a lot of ways we just don't do today, specifically for families. Where do we produce family housing? It's in the suburbs, far away from employment, far away from our amenities, and we commit families to just commuting everywhere and having multiple cars and the cost burden of that, and living what is generally a very unsustainable lifestyle. Just sort of to quickly kind of outline sort of my model and how we envision transportation around these houses. We assembled the necessary pieces to make the lifestyle not only work, but provide a really exceptional quality of life. So we build only in walkable neighborhoods close to amenities and employment. We have put a big emphasis on cycling. So a large bike garage on AAA cycling network. We live or we build on frequent transit routes, and we are big fans of moto car share. So we always put a moto car share on site, and there's always 3 or 4 moto cars within a 5 to 8 minute walk of our developments. Beyond transportation, I talked about the gentle density piece. We also really believe in engagement and having a conversation around these things with the neighborhood and having authentic engagement, and investing a lot of time into that. And we put a big emphasis on family housing as well, because we just do such a poor job of that today around the downtown core where people like to live and play. So that's, you know, in a nutshell, my business model. And I want to quickly highlight like the good reasons why we want this kind of housing, how this moves us forward towards a more sustainable, healthy, and vibrant future. First of all, it's just more affordable housing options, right? So a single family home in South Saanich right now, the benchmark price is just under $1 million, $950,000. It is way out of reach of most people, and that house is benchmark, which means it probably has a leaky basement and needs some work. You'll have no problem finding housing well over $1 million. When you take cars out of the equation, and in our case as well, we also take all fossil fuel heating out of the equation as well. That's more than a 50% reduction in household emissions. We're working through some carbon accounting on that and comparing it to different options. But it is a significant reduction in emissions. We know by far our biggest carbon footprint comes from personal vehicles. By not putting parking spots on, we don't need drive aisles, we don't need secondary parking. All that space we turn into green space. So on a single lot project, we're able to put 22 trees. That's a net increase of 15, and just lots of landscaping, and it just creates really beautiful context. As an example, our Richmond project is about a 700% increase in property taxes, which is something that it surprises me that we don't talk more about. But like that's money that's used for sidewalks, that's used for fixing potholes, that's for adding, buying new parks, adding to new parks. These are these public services that really make great neighborhoods, and that you need to finance them somehow. So our one project will pay about the same amount of property taxes as the entire block of single family homes down the street. We're also paying almost $300,000 in direct community amenities like a bus stop, new sidewalks, upgrading underground pipes, and so forth. And we do lots of community engagement around this. So there's lots of good reasons why we want this kind of housing. And this is like, these are the nuts and bolts of just what makes a better place to live. And there's lots I could go into around community building and engagement and so forth. So maybe we might have time for that in the conversation after. But this stuff is really important. However, building it is an extremely long, a risky and complex process, which is why we see hardly any of this, especially like no one's doing the car-free stuff. And we simply just aren't building enough of that sort of gentle density housing because it's just way too long, risky, and complex. So for our project on Richmond, we're expecting 3 years before people are actually going to be able to move in and live there. We're hoping for less, but that's
yeah, it's in the cupboard.
It has to go in the fridge.
It's not opened yet.
Glenn, can you mute, please?
Thank you. So the timelines are really important in this. And when it comes to, and this comes down to the rezoning process, which is to say, we have a designated use for a property today, which we say is the default is single family. You have to go through rezoning to put anything else on there. And that process itself can take 2 years or more. And that involves numerous iterations to the designs as you work back and forth with the community, municipal planners, the advisory design panel. So on the cheap side, this phase is investing $150,000 to $200,000 in designs and municipal fees and consultants and all those things before whether you're going to be able to build anything or not. That's considered very high risk money. That's money that can just disappear in a puff of smoke. So that's very high risk. It's also a very political process, the rezoning process. There is a multitude of policies and planning documents that are supposed to guide development, but it all comes down to a council vote of whether to approve your application or not. You can go in with an application and meet every single policy and get voted down. You can go in with a proposal that does not meet policy and planning objectives and so forth and get voted up. Municipal councils have that kind of power. And a lot of it comes down to the night of the public hearing, so the night of the vote, where sort of anyone can come out and speak. And a lot of it is just how many people come out and speak in favor or against. And from a business perspective, like, that is insanely risky. Like, it puts a lot of power in the community, which on the face of it is not a bad thing, but in practical terms, it creates this incentive where it's like, this is a very difficult business proposition, which changes the incentive of actors in the marketplace. So I want to put this in perspective. So that kind of housing and all the benefits that I talked about, that's really hard to do. Nobody's doing the car-free stuff for all of those reasons and more. I want to highlight here, this is a house that's for sale right now. A house like this would be single family zoned. The property would be single family zoned right out the gate. So you don't have to go through any rezoning process. So it's faster, it's easier, it's way less risky to build something like this. So to compare it to the project I'm doing, this house is worth $2.8 million on the market right now. It has a 552 square foot, 545 square foot car garage. That's about the size of a 1-bedroom apartment. The frontage is this massive paved space. It's all concrete. It uses natural gas. This one house is using 53% more land than our 9 homes on Richmond. Provides no local amenity contributions and a minimal additional property tax increase and no community engagement. So this is what we say this is what we fast track. This is what's easy to build. This is what's safe to build. This is what's, from most builders' perspective, this is what's most practical to build. And when our incentives incentivize this over much more affordable, sustainable housing options, that perpetuates our dependency on cars. It exacerbates our affordability crisis, and it undermines our ability to move towards just more healthy, sustainable communities. And quite frankly, that's madness, like absolutely madness. It makes zero sense. It is in contradiction to every planning, housing, and climate policy and objective that we have. But that's the incentive that we have today. The other approach to take is to just build the biggest thing you can get away with, right? So if you make it worth the risk. So if that process is that difficult, that hard, and that risky, you just ask for the moon. This is a photograph from Brentwood Center in Burnaby. And you've got the second tallest building in BC across the street from a 1-story single family rancher. Like, this is crazy development. Like, this is a really unhealthy pattern. And it speaks to sort of a lot of the craziness that goes into the process. And this kind of development, it's extremely slow, it's extremely expensive, and you just erase whatever was there before. Like, this is like scorched earth, come up with something completely different than what used to be there. And from the start, there's no meaningful engagement that you can do with a neighborhood. Like, the gap between this kind of change in density to what would have been there before is just so unreconcilable. Like, engagement means almost nothing. The other approach is sprawl, right? The other approach is just to build where there's no one who is going to make noise, right? Like, no one's going to show up to council to speak on behalf of the trees. So our urban landscape keeps expanding as we don't build the housing where we need to be building it, making better use of the land we already have. So we build outwards, and I don't think I need to list the reasons to this group why that's not a good idea. So, from a system perspective, like, municipal bylaws set the rules of the game. And quite frankly, we are dismally failing to address our housing and climate crises. Our hope is that our projects become templates for building better homes and communities, that we can showcase the car-free lifestyle. We can demonstrate how it enriches the neighborhood while dramatically reducing our environmental footprint. And through example, we can help to shift and push municipal policy. Broadly speaking, I think we need to look at housing and our transportation choices as an ecosystem, not individual transactions, not individual projects, but how does the ecosystem work? Because when you make one thing difficult, that puts pressure other places. So when we make good housing and good density difficult, that creates all these unintended consequences that work against our objectives. So I think it's really important to have these kind of conversations to broaden the awareness around what's really happening on the ground on this stuff, and to be clear about what is happening in this environment in which people make decisions about how they move and where they live. So I'll leave it there. That's all from me. I really look forward to hearing from my colleagues, Christine and Kaylee, and joining in the conversation after. So that's it.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you very much. I'm interested in the idea, I might come back to it, of sort of thinking of it as an ecosystem. It reminds me of the cumulative impact work in looking at pollution and what have you. Anyway, let us turn straight to Finn. We'll take questions later. We'll turn straight to Christine, and then following her, Kaylee, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. But you can always put questions in the chat box too.
All right. Thanks, Julian. Great presentation. And thank you, Trevor, for the opportunity to be here this evening. It really is a privilege to be part of a conversation with individuals that are engaged with making our community better for more people. I'm going to frame the missing middle housing conversation a little more so that there's common language for your discussion later on. An understanding of the characteristics that impact what's missing, and some context for having it emerge as more common. So middle housing typologies include the duplex, the triplex, the fourplex, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, townhouses, and multiplexes that existed historically prior to the 1940s. So the term missing applies, as these are typologies that stopped being built. It also applies in the context of housing types that are affordable to the middle income market. So a consistent market housing that is missing from an affordability perspective. So middle housing is house scaled. It's often 2 or 2.5 stories. And because it was not a focus of buildings after the 1940s, it tends toward a more traditional expression in existing neighborhoods, where examples obviously can be found. All of the typologies, including the bungalow courts and courtyard housing, can be found in our community, where there are a number of excellent and occupied examples. So to summarize, missing middle housing is a range of multi-unit or clustered housing types, compatible in scale with detached single-family homes, and it is a typology that supports the demand for walkable, livable living, but it's missing from our established residential neighborhoods. We're going to unpack this a little bit more in our conversation this evening. So, okay, so why is the middle missing? So I'm going to go through a number of items. So market context, supply and demand. Buying habits continue to inform decisions around what is supplied to the market. So continued value increase in single family and multifamily residential units reinforce the status quo. It does not incentivize the development community to innovate. And I'd like to point out that Julian is definitely an exception. Further, planning approaches and financial systems reinforce the development community, establishing clear parameters from a regulatory and financial perspective for pursuing limited typologies. So it's a self-perpetuating system. And they're really defined by a clear process, which Julian has outlined, low risk and profitability. The cost of construction. The cost of labor, material, and entitlement inflate the price of single-family homes where there is little economy of scale, and influence a bias towards mid and high-rise typologies where the economies of scale are most effective. And again, Julian shared that with us. Single-family homes become even less affordable and the dominant product available in the market, which diverges from livability considerations that are increasingly desired as a community matures. Land valuation. This is a metric for calculating the value of a piece of property, which accounts for the land plus improvements. There's a perception that this is about the site, cut into a discrete slice with a nod to other comparable slices. It's important to understand that this value is also tied to context and the considerations of walkability and livability. This ties to lifestyle objectives and desirability of a particular neighborhood. Middle housing demand emerges from increasingly complex urban environments and the value of land, which tends to be higher. Development benefits from distributing value over more units, but within that more complex context. In other words, there's a timing piece here, and the maturation of how and what we value as a community becomes more complete. And we're kind of there. Community planning. So the province requires local governments to establish regional growth strategies, which are to be designed to promote patterns of settlement that are socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable. The objective is to make efficient use of infrastructure and land and to enhance resilience. Contrary to a model of urban sprawl, the regional growth strategy works toward ensuring that development takes place where there's adequate facilities, minimizes the use of automobiles, and encourages alternate transportation modes, support adequate, affordable, and appropriate housing, and engage in good stewardship of the land for present and future generations. This really is fertile ground for middle housing initiatives. For local government, zoning bylaws regulate uses, permitted as well, regulate the uses that are permitted, as well as the type and size of buildings that can be developed. This includes considerations of lot sizes, landscaping, and providing off-street parking. Zoning also accounts for broader infrastructure objectives, including stormwater management, transportation networks, and the urban forest. This crazy image suggests the constellation of these objectives in a built form that is trying to address all considerations, perhaps rather than a prioritization that places people and a healthy environment first. Prioritization may be an interesting consideration to enable middle housing, as might a complete rethink of zoning as a governant and a shaper of community. Community engagement processes. These are vital in development and play a key, arguably gatekeeper role in how neighborhoods influence or oppose change. With the intention of being participatory, many engagement processes on land development amplify the voices of a few and may not reflect a more fulsome representation of a neighborhood, or a neighborhood that is undergoing change from new households and demographics. Awareness of how you can participate and influence decision-making is important, particularly as it applies to communicating need and a desire for households seeking middle housing. Lifestyle choices. Market demand for middle housing is centered around a shift in demographics to smaller households with fewer members. Households without children and single-person households are common. And these households are seeking to live in neighborhoods that offer a sense of identity, are inclusive, and offer the social support of community. There's also a need to acknowledge changing consumption patterns and choices, the recognition of quality over quantity, and a desire to live more intentionally reflects a mindfulness to the larger issues of climate change and the role of our lifestyle choices in reducing impact. Middle housing also addresses aging communities and a need for housing for the elderly. This can include transitioning from a single-family typology with a desire to remain in the same neighborhood where social networks and relationships remain. Acknowledging a changing mindset of the commodification of housing to broader considerations of lifestyle and livability. This is important. The equation of value of an investment in housing beyond square footage and traditional land valuation, and the realities of affordability, considering real incomes. Middle housing trends towards lower first costs within proximity to employment opportunities, neighborhood amenities, and a sense of community. So, finding middle housing and realizing gentle density. What are some of the key characteristics that are emerging that are a foundation of this typology? Well, alternative transportation choices and infrastructure to support them. Individuals, families, and households are choosing to live without car ownership and embracing walking, cycling, car share memberships, and public transportation. The investment in a meaningful urban realm, like wider or separated sidewalks and dedicated bicycle lanes. There's also car share and ride share initiatives and frequent convenient bus service, and they all play a role in influencing the demand on our streets and the space allocation to dedicated off-street parking. Enabling the establishment and growth of neighborhood amenities. This really arises from neighborhood planning, with a focus on walkability and more immediate access to local goods and services. These are corner stores, coffee shops, pubs, hair salons, and yoga studios. One or more amenities that are frequented by a local clientele. Official community plans identify neighborhood nodes and respond flexibly to these initiatives, recognizing the value of walkability and livability. Attention to good design. More compact living choices are only achievable with good design. This includes clever storage, modular or flexible use of space, quality materials and products that are efficient to operate and can be maintained. Good design optimizes square footage. It doesn't maximize it. Optimization comes from understanding the market and not designing for the commodification of an investment property. Designing for living, not selling. Flexible, compact, clever. Innovation in construction. So pressures within the construction industry, including skilled labor shortages, availability of labor, availability and cost of materials, and the cost of land and development all invite innovation. We're at the tipping point. Both the product and the time it takes to deliver on site, which affects the cost of money borrowing, are really increasingly challenged. Middle housing lends itself to modular construction, repeatable, simple forms that use modular and nested components that can be assembled readily and easily on site, or can be entirely fabricated off-site and set in place. Innovation in community planning, evaluating the potential of prioritizing zoning objectives, not simply applying them. Think of the tension between on-site parking and green space, or front doors and street presence to vehicle access and driveways. It means looking at alternative zoning approaches, as well as establishing objectives that inform housing that is scaled to fit into mature existing neighborhoods and reflects prioritizing people and ecology over the automobile. This is particularly important in complete communities that are inherently walkable, served by alternative transportation, and have amenities. You've seen this image, and I apologize, Julian, you have a more current version of this, but innovation and courage in proposing developments that align with alternative transportation choices. This car-free middle housing townhouse typology is proposed in a mature and transitioning neighborhood. This creative developer, and thank you, Julian, is recognizing that the conditions are right for such a proposal and is bold in offering a car-independent, ground-oriented, clever solution. Attainability by design. Smaller units in a multiplex form. Land costs distributed across more households, lower construction costs, incremental in scale, and developed in a walkable, mature neighborhood. This housing development recently approved on Richardson proposes 24 households with a reduced on-site parking provision. So there is still parking. In this case, the site plan was not driven by the automobile, but by the consideration of context, scale, and right sizing of the units to secure affordability. Middle housing forms that align in character, scale, and configuration to their context, providing 24 units on the equivalent of 2 standard lots. Relevant design solutions. It's important to note that the middle housing is style neutral. This beautiful example of a contemporary duplex is nested in a mature neighborhood with adjacent housing stock that is of traditional character, yet it fits as it's consistent in scale and proportion, how the housing addresses the street, and the reprioritization of green space and landscaping over parking. Innovation of typologies that are anchored in a strong sense of community. Middle housing that is oriented around a shared or common space, appealing particularly to smaller households or single person households, where a sense of connection and security is inherent in the design. The pocket neighborhoods can be by design, as this one is, a clustering of small homes or multi-units around a green space. And they can also emerge from a neighborhood scale reprioritization of green space, connecting neighbors to neighbors with middle housing in the mix, alongside established single-family homes, laneway homes, garden suites, and coach houses. Perhaps even block-wide initiatives that encourage a common rather than individual yards. And finally, designing the in-between. Thinking about every aspect of how buildings and spaces can be designed to support life and the activities of life. The idea of mapping toward a whole rather than singular solutions on individual lots. Middle housing emerges from increasing complexity in communities and an evolution of neighborhoods, not reinvention. It acknowledges households of today and aligns a built form that reinforces lifestyle choice. It needs a regulatory environment that prioritizes middle housing forms, invites innovation, and anchors in good design. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That's a great deal to think about and really quite fascinating. I should internally have mentioned that Christine is also a specialist in biomimicry. We didn't see a lot of that in there, but that sort of relationship between the organic and the built, I think, is really very fascinating. So we're going to turn now to Kaylee, and Kaylee will explain what it is she does better than I can. But it is about, in many ways, helping organizations such as and companies such as Julian to get to where they want to get to. Is that a fair summation? If not, you'll tell us. We're not hearing you, Kaylee.
Can you hear me?
Oh, now we can.
Okay, great. All right, and can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you, Trevor. And yeah, it's been such a pleasure to, briefly connect yesterday on this and this opportunity. As Christine said, I really appreciate it. And it's my first time meeting Julian, which is fantastic. So it's always great to have these networking opportunities. So as Trevor mentioned, I'm a professional planner by training, and I predominantly work in the below market sphere. So generally, I would say our organization, there's about 6 of us professional planners together that works with nonprofit, Indigenous governments and municipalities who are seeking alternative housing provisions within their communities, whether they come at us when there's a vision or a gap within the community that needs to be addressed, or sometimes they come at it with an opportunity, such as a land opportunity or a funding opportunity. So because of that and the other 2 speakers this evening, I've decided to focus on a bit of an equity lens and a planning distribution lens around housing provision. So if you bear that in mind, knowing that equity planning itself has actually been around since the late 1960s, which basically focuses on planning and regulatory systems that actually address the folks sort of the hardest or most vulnerable, and the ones that have been most ignored in traditional policies. It's part of the general planning conversation now, and I'm going to present tonight a few opportunities that we're working on, as well as some international opportunities to realize more equitable and attainable planning, as well as chat a little bit about policy and grounding how we got where we are and where we are in Canada right now. So I just wanted to mention that traditionally, in my opinion, housing has really been a place where wealth has been generated. And both Julian and Christine have touched on this. And that it's been more of a transactional element of our lives. I'll speak a little bit to Canadians, in my opinion, obsession with home ownership. And now this lens about looking at housing as an opportunity really for human bonds and connections and opportunities to allow us all to be part of a larger community. So where we find ourselves today, and there's quite a bit of information in my presentation, and I will share it with Trevor after the fact for folks to reference, but over 2/3 of Canadian households are homeowners. And the vast majority of rental is privately owned at the moment. Now, of course, this is changing with our national housing strategy in Canada, but that's been fairly recent since the federal government disinvested from below market housing in the 70s and 80s. So what this has done is led to a significant segregation between rental and home ownership, and also the people that are renters and homeowners. I'm sure many of us are well familiar with some of the public hearings of renters versus the owner conversation, but of course this has led to a significant wealth gap. And there's obvious socioeconomic implications of this, both within generations as within cultures and folks' legacy within Canada as citizens. So this has led to a significant spatial distribution. We call it the sorting effect often in planning of who gets to live where, both geographically as well as physically, and how they're housed or homed. There's an increasing recognition of this environmental and socioeconomic effect that the market has been driving. And it is in large part due to the retention and protection of historic, colonial, and linear restrictive policies that both Julian and Christine have mentioned. And this understanding that these are no longer serving our communities or reflect our truly inclusive needs and desires to build community. So how did we get here in this place? Both of the speakers have touched on the land use patterns, and I will also assume that folks are fairly familiar with how our suburban and single family home regulatory system has come to be. I will just note that zoning was often conceived in large cities as a way to address public health and safety concerns. Of course, this has given way to significantly regulated environment that has led to strong injustices and inequities between populations and demographics. And as I mentioned, home ownership has always been encouraged as the safest and easiest way to increase personal wealth, therefore commodifying our housing. Similarly, we got here recently because the definition of affordability has been a large part of a conversation that has changed and modified over time. Just for people's knowledge, in the past, until the mid-80s, the federal government defined affordability as someone's, let me get this right, as someone's post-tax income not spending more than 25% on their housing requirements, which would include rent or a mortgage, as well as ancillary costs such as utilities. That is now changed to at least 30%. So folks shouldn't be spending any more than 30% of their after-tax income. If they are, they're considered in housing deficit. But of course, there's lots of challenges with this, as wages, we all know, have not kept up with housing rental or ownership prices. And prices have obviously escalated significantly, particularly in the last 2 decades. This has also led us to some discrimination in policies, access and availability to safe, secure, adequate housing, and has led to us not necessarily providing housing across the entire continuum of typologies and opening up opportunities that might meet more equitable distribution of housing. So just a little bit of background, and this is fairly recent, and it's something that a lot of folks in my industry are quite pleased and proud of, those of us that were part of this movement. But the National Housing Strategy was introduced 4 years ago, and it did receive royal assent on June 21st, 2 years ago. It finally brings Canada in line with international standards, which require the right to housing to be ensured not just through policies and programs, but through independent monitoring and access to hearings and remedies. And why this is such a big deal is because it's something that we can hold government, all levels of government, accountable to, the progressive realization of this right to housing. So previous to this, there was a lack to any meaningful accountability to hold different levels of government to this commitment. And since this royal assent in 2019, there has now been a national right to housing network that is formed. And this network, the goal is to mobilize a broad-based grassroots civil society network to realize this housing commitment and hold different levels of government accountable. So this might be a familiar image to some. This is called the housing continuum. And this is what in the last 15 or so years we've been using in a linear fashion to look at how we can provide housing to all populations within our communities. You can tell it kind of goes from left to right, a progression from homelessness on one side with shelters and a crisis accommodation, all of those being government subsidized, of course, right through to home ownership on the right side of the diagram. And basically it depicts typologies of housing provision with different levels of government intervention, with the idea that the ultimate goal would be home ownership in a market situation at the top end. An alternative to this, as we consider the embodiment of more equitable planning and housing distribution, is something called the wheelhouse model. And the idea of this is that there's no top or bottom, it's not hierarchical, but that basically the view of housing is one that homeownership is only one potential goal, and that there's a more diverse and inclusive view that takes into account the constantly changing needs of all residents in different income streams and different stages in their life as well. So it considers more about appropriateness of housing and home as opposed to progression and a financialization or housing as a commodity. So I'm going to chat a little bit about our current standard from a provincial lens. I'm going to use a BC housing project as an example, and then provide 4 different components that we might want to consider as alternative living arrangements or innovations, even from an equity lens, to reach more equitable housing goals. So I've got 2 examples of current projects I have in the works with nonprofits in Greater Victoria. Both have applied for BC Housing Community Housing Fund dollars. They both look substantially different from the outside, but I will touch on why they actually are fairly standard within the prescriptive nature of our current social housing provision. So BC Housing is unique in Canada. It is a one-stop shop, some folks say, for provincial and federal dollars. So they get a certain allocation from the federal government as part of the National Housing Strategy. They have 3 arms to them. One is the landholding arm, or PRHC, which acquires assets for BC Housing to own and operate. One is the capital arm, which is where nonprofits and governments apply for funding, capital funding. And the third is their operational arm. So operational dollars for organizations, as well as operational funding for their own projects. So my organization currently has over a dozen of these projects in the works. On average, in my experience, and I know Christine has experience here as well, these projects take 3 to 6 years from conception to completion. I should note I have some projects that are near 10 or 11 as well. And I'm sure Julian can speak to the approval piece of the municipal government, but with BC Housing, you add on additional provincial requirements, a significant amount of red tape and process requirements to ensure you're meeting provincial goals alongside your organization, your community, and your municipal goals. Their projects are also competitive for capital dollars because we're all bidding for discrete buckets of funding, both within communities, as well as in some ways you're competing with the province itself, who obviously undertakes their own projects, which we have a number in downtown Victoria underway right now. The cost of these provincial projects, there's additional requirements from a design perspective, quite stringent design guidelines, energy requirements, procurement requirements that do add extra time, but also additional and elevated costs to these projects. I have told some people, in my experience, these projects upon completion are often 20 or 30% higher than what the private sector can deliver, often with achieving the same standards of design. And also when you enter with BC Housing, you're entering into a long-term relationship. So it's usually 35 or plus years with a subsidized takeout mortgage or with an operational agreement. So all of that being said, this can lead to somewhat of a fairly standard prescriptive response to housing provision, where pushing the boundaries for innovation or alternatives can be quite challenging. So I just want to quickly highlight 4 different types of projects that I am currently envisioning with some clients, both with the province and the federal government. I have no pictures to share at this point, but I've got a number of examples in here that folks can reference in the future. So one of them is the co-housing or co-living model. And there's some great examples in the States of these right now for increasing social relations and connectivity between different demographics and ages. It can often be a different way to provide affordability for both owners and renters, as there's significant land and infrastructure efficiencies, just like what Julian touched on. It also can provide higher levels of services and amenities because there's more efficiencies working together than as individual single family homeowners. And there's opportunities for mixed co-living as well as working. And this can lead and address some other inequities that we find in single family housing, such as gender and income disparities. For example, we do know co-living arrangements, whether it's within a family unit itself or a larger co-living arrangement, can minimize housework and child rearing requirements that often do fall to the females in the household. In the essence of time, I'm just going to move on swiftly. There's also obviously the small home movement or tiny home movement. The median house size in North America has exploded, as we all know, but we also know that there is an increased desire from certain demographics for smaller spaces with optimization of that space, as Christine mentioned. And so the marketing of these are obviously crucial because I really do think the tiny home language, to some degree, it really limits the opportunity of ADUs, or what we call accessory dwelling units, which could be a tiny home on a trailer, like my friend in the Yukon built in this picture, or something like the tiny village that Arise in the Victoria have recently helped for folks sheltering in place. So there's opportunity for open sourced ideas, which really generates ingenuity and creativity. And there's alternative financial arrangements that potentially can be available for smaller projects like this. Multi-generational as well. So there's big opportunities. This example in this picture is something called a 2-flat, which is a very specific design in Chicago, which is basically an up and down duplex, which was developed in the 20s and 30s. And they're highly sought after now in Chicago as places for intergenerational families to live or grow. And opportunities like this, we need to consider in our typologies and our policies. We know that there's a significant amount of under-occupied housing in Canada. Their estimate is 10 to 15 million spare bedrooms in our country alone. There's business opportunities, such as this organization in the States called Nesterly, which pairs seniors or older folks where their kids have fled the coop and they've got extra space in their household. And lastly, looking at housing that heals from a health and an environmental health perspective. So really considering the quality of materials, the location, and the performance to contribute to livability as the absolute priority in housing. This also includes looking at the housing first model, which is housing as a basic human right, and that until everybody is housed, mental and physical needs cannot necessarily be reflected or respected. There's increasing repurposing of land uses being considered around North America as well. Some folks are talking about re-envisioning the old agricultural working forms from a cultural, healing, and mental health perspective, as well as obviously a large opportunity to reconnect with local land bases from a traditional and cultural knowledge perspective. So how do we achieve this housing in a more equitable way? So there's a number of policy opportunities that both Christine and Julian have spoke to. Here's just a few of them that we work with on most of our projects. I would say something I've been reading a lot in the news lately is the lessons learned from COVID-19 already. and that it wasn't necessarily density in these large cities that led to the spread of some of the virus, but it actually has really emphasized that there's a large socioeconomic disparity because it was policy that influenced those challenges more than anything. And so here's a number of things, maybe food for thought in the conversation. And similarly at the leadership and advocacy level, really rethinking how we've historically used land uses, and that those models no longer necessarily serve us, and maybe they never have, honestly. Looking for leadership to govern by example. I really like that picture of the Saanich Council that Julian proposed. The City of Victoria is bringing forward to their council a staff report that recommends staff delegated authority for affordable housing projects within zones that tolerate or already accept that typology of project. We look to our leadership to use, I think, carrots and sticks in parallel, that there's lots of mechanisms to both incentivize as well as discourage certain typologies and certain policies. And also really encouraging transparency and co-learning, that lots of these things, these 4 examples I've provided here are being done elsewhere, and there's lots of lessons learned to be gleaned from those other examples. And this is my last slide. I think most folks on this call probably understand the value of citizenry participation. I would say that there's, I think, a gleaming hope in my eye of a shift from a no culture to a yes culture in our community. There's a lot of opportunities for folks to come out to support projects, not just to come out against projects. A lot of us are investing in community to help with that education piece, to open up those dialogues that help equip people with the tools to come out and say yes, and vote and invest in those. So I will leave it at that. I'm sorry I spoke a little bit long there, Trevor, but I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all 3 of you. That was a very thorough set of presentations. In terms of time, because I do want to get us into small groups, but if there are a couple of quick questions, I think in terms of where the discussions might focus, if we go back to, and you don't need to put it up, I don't think, but Kaylee's last slide. How do we, in a sense, I guess the discussion question might be, how do we get to yes? So, so much of what we hear is we know what needs to be done. We know in many ways how to do it, but there are barriers, part of which are community culture barriers about, as Kaylee put it, a no culture versus a yes culture. And I think it was you, Kaylee, or somebody yesterday said, how do we go from NIMBY to YIMBY, to yes in my backyard? So if you do have a quick question, just wave your hand or use your hand putting up tool, which is under reactions. There's a button under reactions that says raise hand. If not, we will go to a short break and then get reassigned into small groups, I think. Any quick comments or thoughts or questions? And Finn, you will have noticed, has been creating a sort of running commentary in the chat box, which is we will also save, and that will be useful too. Thank you, Finn.
Yeah, I just can never keep my mouth shut on stuff, so I just dropped some thoughts on everything while I was watching the presentation. Yeah,
it's appreciated. Okay, well, I think I'm not seeing a lot of questions. I think that some of the ideas that I pick up on there, particularly I like the idea of thinking of this as an ecosystem, and how do we change this ecosystem? How do we think of it, that notion of sort of cumulative impact, instead of looking at one development at a time, look at the neighborhood, look at the whole understanding of what's going on. How do we get to that? But how do we get to yes, I think might be the challenge we face. Before we break into small groups, just a quick note there from Wendy saying, please put me and Alicia in the same group if possible. I'll just highlight that to Claire and Gertie.
Trevor, I have a question.
Yes.
and that is just about when you've got nonprofits wanting to kind of, so people who don't have the land but don't have the resources to pull a coalition of different groups together. And I'm just wondering if any of you could speak to that. That often it's you know, it's there's so much money involved, and it's a risk to go and look at developing, especially if you're going to access the BC housing funding, what resources there are to help facilitate that process. And I'm thinking, yeah.
That question was to Kaylee.
I'll go first. You know, we're in a, you know, I think the traditional nonprofit perspective, if you have an asset, I call an asset land, because inevitably the actual physical asset may no longer be an asset after some point. A lot of nonprofits are kind of land rich and cash poor. And I think that's a bit of a generality, but I experience that a lot. Most recently, our market conditions in Victoria have really changed, as everybody knows, which makes those land rich nonprofits quite valuable partners. And I know a lot of folks are being approached quite a bit by the private sector right now. I also know most municipalities are looking for unique partnerships to realize different community needs and goals, and they can be done really successfully. And I also know a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of strength, whether it's community relationships and connectivity and that social fabric piece, and longstanding relationships that maybe the development industry doesn't have. And so I think there's a lot of unique value nonprofits can bring. At the same time, accessing private financing, even if it's with a credit union, is very challenging. You're totally right. As is often in my experience, the biggest hurdle is the bucks before the big bucks. So the pre-development dollars, as Julian said, it's, you know, these projects don't even get to council before you spend a couple $100,000 often, not to mention the incredible sweat equity of the board members and committee members. So those dollars, there's grants and programs out there, but if you can achieve those and get your project to a certain point, I think, then often the bigger bucks are easier to attract. If that answers your question, I think Christine and Julian probably have thoughts too.
Yeah, a couple things I could throw in there. I think those are huge opportunities. I think there's a lot of institutional lands that yeah, just they own big pieces of land in really incredible places, and everything starts from the right piece of land. The land really defines what you can and can't do. So a partner like a church, they can do so much if it's done well, like so much. Like it's incredible, the opportunity that's there. My business partner actually had a chance to talk with David Eby from the province, and he bent his ear around how BC Housing needs to take a greater leadership role in moving forward the development process with nonprofit partners. There's too many examples of where, you know, a church gave free land, they've got essentially free money from BC Housing, and they still weren't able to make a project work. And often these groups just don't have the background and experience and expertise to deliver these things. That said, there are some people that can help with that. Kaylee's probably a great person to talk with about connecting the dots. But there's also a nonprofit developer called Catalyst that specializes in, that's their model, is to work with a partner who has land or some kind of asset and to provide that sort of development expertise. It's the kind of thing that's like, it's not in my wheelhouse, but there's other people who have similar sort of vision and values and have expertise in that area that can help those organizations be successful.
And Christine, I know you have to go to something else right now. Any parting words before you head off?
Yeah, just echo both Kaylee and Julian's comments, and only add that healthy ecosystems thrive in relationship. And it's really important to recognize these mature organizations that often are doing huge heavy lifting in the community. And that, you know, whether it's a faith-based or whatever the initiative is, there's this wonderful connectivity, and those not-for-profits represent an enormous, think of them, I'm going to put on my biomimicry hat, think of them as, you know, the mycorrhizal network of your community, and that ability to connect and to seed and nurture incredible connections to new developments. And I think that's often we other rather than and those relationships are key.
Thank you. Well, folks, I think what we'll do before we go, Claire, anything you need by way of information, if you're not staying for the conversation in small groups, please do let us know through the chat box so Claire and Gertie can make a decent stab at this. I think we'll have probably 3 groups by the looks of the size of the group here. We'll take a 10-minute break, maybe a 5-minute break actually, because we're a little bit behind where we usually are, and reconvene at 6:40 into the large group to hear what sort of bright, new, amazing ideas may have come out of the conversation you have. But I think the underlying question is, how do we get to yes with so much of this that we know needs to be done, we know can be done, but isn't happening? Okay, thank you. And thank you to our 3 speakers, much appreciated.
Trevor.